The elevator fell quiet the instant the little voice cut through the auto-closing doors. "Mommy?" It wasn't pitched like a child's joke or a misdirected plea. It was a sharp, honest shout that landed in the air between polished shoes and briefcases. People looked at each other first because that is what strangers do in small, awkward emergencies. Eyes searching for the owner of the interruption. Then they looked at her. She was not like the others. In a building of suits and quiet commerce, she moved as if the floors were arranged to suit her, deliberate, cool, a line drawn through the noise. Sloan Whitfield kept her hands in her coat pockets until the last second. She let the heels click, then stopped. The halo of city light caught the glass at the back of the elevator and made her face an image everyone knew from headlines. A woman who managed billions with the same calm with which she managed a conversation. They called her the Ice Queen, not in affection, but in recognition of the way the world bent to her steadiness. Across from her, a little girl with hair like sun-roughed yarn beamed up, as if at the sight of a lighthouse. Her small shoes were pink and scuffed at the toes. They had been loved awkwardly. In the pause that followed the shout, the child looked up again, expectation unblinking. Someone laughed nervously. A man near the back, who smelled faintly of oil and winter coat, cleared his throat and moved to the door like he had somewhere else to be. The elevator doors opened, and people dispersed with the practiced indifference of a city that has learned how to ignore the personal entanglements of others. Only Sloan stayed a breath longer, the heat of the cabin receding, the moment sticking like a tag. She watched the little girl, and then the man with the heavy hands. He stooped, gathered the girl's backpack with a soft efficiency, and called her by a name she'd answered to all morning. "Rosie," he said, and the way he said it, steady, familiar, not called out for public sympathy, made the sound of "mommy" seem like an accusation lodged instead of an answer. If this is the kind of story that finds you, consider subscribing for more. Short stories of ordinary people who collide with extraordinary feelings. Cole Harrison's world smelled like grease and night, and the faint lemon of industrial cleaner. He learned early to translate sounds into schedules. Furnace hum meant 2 hours until the boilers cycled. Laughter downstairs meant the night shift crew had found an improv joke to keep awake. The ticking of the old fluorescent tubes above the maintenance office kept him company while the city slept. He carried a little bag with second-hand sandwiches and a thermos that never stayed hot long. His jacket had a frayed collar from where he had folded it back and back again, a small, visible seam of making do. Rosie, Roz, to everyone who loved her, fit into his hands the way a memory does into a photograph, imperfect but treasured. When Meredith died, it had been a single sentence of news that rearranged their lives. The car accident took the small adult world they'd built and left the household in a manageable, raw shape. Cole never thought he'd be someone who could navigate both oil stains and kindergarten permission slips, but grief had a way of teaching new muscles. He learned to pack lunches while fixing faulty valves, to change the couch cushion covers with one hand, to soothe a setback with a half-smile that said, "I'm still here." They lived in a section of the building's basement that no one photographed for glossy real estate spreads, a narrow couch that flopped when it rained, a lamp that tilted like it was in conversation with the ceiling, a makeshift fort built from a discarded pallet and a tangle of throw blankets. It became, by necessity and by invention, a home between the certified hours when Cole punched the time card and the half-awake afternoons when he took Rosie for pancakes on Sundays. Mr. Buttons sat on the couch's shoulder most nights. He was a mauve stuffed rabbit whose ear had been restitched so often the fabric had developed a pleat of patience. Rosie believed Mr. Buttons could translate her drawings into weather reports. Whatever the belief system, child logic, inherited ritual, immediate consolation. Roz loved to make pictures. She would sit cross-legged on the floor with a crayon clenched like a conductor's baton and fill a page with suns and ladders and figures under wobbly houses. Cole kept them in a shoebox that smelled faintly of paper and glue, a reliquary of small victories, an intact tooth, a report card with an A for participation, a finger painting referencing a family of 3 with a sun smiling down. Cole had his rituals too. He checked on Rosie before every shift, running his hand along the edge of the couch where she slept, making sure the blanket wasn't twisted in a way that would keep the wind in. He tied her shoelaces twice because his mother had taught him once was negligent and twice was thoughtful, a superstition that had, over time, become a promise. Once is never enough, sweetheart. When she watched him tug the final knot and stand, Rosie would sometimes pat his cheek with the blunt concentration of someone measuring love by the amount of tie. He worked nights to keep the lights on and to never have to explain to her why she couldn't have a teacher who came to school. Nights meant he could be present with a job that paid in overtime and in being able to scoop Rosie up from early releases. Babysitters fell through like tiny collapses of trust. The woman who got pneumonia, the neighbor whose schedule didn't line up. The building had rules, but it had a heart too. There were always doors that eased and people who let them keep the couch when the landlord never asked too much. Sloan's apartment looked, from the outside, like a photograph. Marble defeated merchandise in a display she had curated with the same intensity she used in quarterly reports. In the middle of her living room, behind a lattice of light and a mirrored wall, sat a glass case of such quietness that anyone who opened it would feel like they'd trespassed on a private museum. Inside the case was a pair of shoes, so small they seemed like a coin's fate. They were pink. The leather had faded in a manner that only time could authorize. There were smudges on the sole, shaped like a child's first steps. She kept them displayed because grief had learned her the language of artifacts. When Wren died in a car accident 3 years earlier, Sloan wrapped meaning in objects. The case was a monument and a barrier at once, clean air around something fragile. 3 years of neat nights had calcified a kind of practical iciness around her. Smiles were rare as snow in summer. People praised her for efficiency and internalized sorrow as if it were the cost of success. Work had become both armor and vacuum. Meetings filled the hours that might otherwise have been devoted to a bedtime story, a reason to go home earlier, a return call. She learned to translate tenderness into spreadsheets and risk analysis. It was easier to measure people in revenue streams than to measure their grief in teaspoons. And yet, every now and then, the case of pink shoes hummed in the periphery of her days, a small containment of something that refused to be reorganized into a board deck. The first nights that Sloan saw Rosie, she did not speak. She watched because watching was the only action she trusted not to be burdensome. From a distance, often while standing by the loading dock with a thermos of coffee gone cold, she'd see the little figure hurrying between a maintenance door and a stairwell, clutching Mr. Buttons and a purple backpack patched with stickers. The shoes caught her eye because they were an echo she hadn't let herself listen to. They were scuffed where a child's toes had been busy. They were the kind of smallness that could be contained in a glass box. It was a dangerous similarity, and she kept her distance. The building had rules that were practical and gossip that was social. People who fit into lobby patterns kept their stories to themselves, but in the hallways, news traveled like electricity. Sloan noticed the way the janitor's carts bent away when people saw her, the way assistants straightened themselves like flags. When she lingered near the basement door to watch Rosie hum a song while waiting for Cole, a security guard would ask if she would like an escort. She declined with a little nod that meant of course not, and then she watched some more. There were nights when she almost stepped down, when the distance felt like a cruelty. Once, on a cold December evening, she found herself at the bottom of the stairs. The basement smelled unexpectedly of laughter and of stale pizza. Rosie had been sitting with crayons and an attention that turned a corner of concrete into a kingdom. She was drawing a picture of an elevator and two people in it, one with a long coat and one with a small, beaming face. Across the top of the page, in wobbly letters, she had written, "Mommy." Sloan stood in the doorway and felt something like a fissure begin to run under her feet. She should have left, she thought, because personal lives connected to her person always led to complications. Yet she stayed. Rosie, who believed in the kindness of strangers too easily and believed in the possibility of enemy spies less, watched the woman in the doorway with a curiosity that was not suspicious. That curiosity announced itself in a misstep. Rosie tripped over a stray board of the fort, a small tumble that sent her crayons clattering like tiny flares. Sloan moved before the exact thought of herself formed. It was not a heroic movement, it was a quickness born of something older than policy. She kneeled, an uncomfortable act for someone who usually met people from a standing vantage, and straightened Rosie's shoes with a precise hand. Her fingers were cool, and the shoelace felt rough under her thumb. She tied it once, then twice, tugging the knot as if she were making a compact with the air. "Once is never enough, sweetheart," Cole said, the first time Rosie learned to tie her own shoelaces. He had said it absent-mindedly, as a rule that made mornings less chaotic, and she had absorbed it like a grammar lesson in love. Sloan tugged the lace twice without thinking about the sentence she did not own. The action seemed to settle something in the little girl. Rosie looked up at Sloan and offered the full authority of a child. "Do you have a mommy?" she asked, the question the kind that bridges mapeless distances. Sloan's reply was a small sound that did not fit in the basement, a catch, like someone sliding a glass plate closed over a sound. She looked at Cole, who had come down to see what the commotion was, and saw the man's jawline used as a map of endurance. He was not looking for sympathy. He was not asking to be observed. He was simply another human who had learned how to hold a child in the absence of the person they had lost. "I do," Sloan said finally, and the syllables made a tray of loneliness. She put the shoelace knot through a second tug, as if to distance herself from the statement. Leaving the basement felt like closing a book she had only begun to reread. That evening, when Cole tucked Rosie in and Mr. Buttons was careful about the placement of an ear, he asked whether anything about Sloan had seemed different. "She smells like the lobby," Rosie said seriously, like an eyewitness. "But she tied my shoe really good. She pulled it twice." Cole smiled tight at the ceiling. "Maybe she just knows how to tie a knot." "Is she a mommy?" Rosie asked, the question being more a fact-gathering exercise than an accusation. "She's someone who makes sure little people don't fall down," Cole answered. "That's a good thing." People noticed small things in the building then. Conversation is efficient that way. One elevator shout turns into a narrative arc by morning. The mommy moment lived on coffee break ripples. Someone saw Sloan in the loading dock the week before. Someone else had noticed a man bringing a child to the basement fort after hours. The building gossip stacked sentences. CEO seen near basement with child. Man brings daughter to work. It did not mention the shoelace tug or the way the girl hummed when she colored a son. Gossip doesn't fit nuance into its mouth. Human resources did their duty in a way that was mechanical and precise. They called Cole up to the 40th floor with a tone that meant no harm, but meant the corporation respected its image. Cole accepted the call with a tiredness that had no posture. He put on a jacket that smelled faintly of the laundry that had to be done and smoothed his palms along his thighs like a man making himself more presentable than the day allowed. Sloan heard the rumor the logical way, as a chain of reports that could have consequences. She heard of the elevator incident and felt the social static that comes with a child's frankness. For someone who commanded shareholder meetings, being the subject of gossip over a child's misdirected exclamation was a new kind of exposure. It was awkward in a way that Prophet never had been. For a day afterward she found herself scanning the lobby for scuffs of pink, imagining the echo of a child's voice inside the glass of her case. She did not know why the memory of small leather shoes pushed so hard against the barrier she had built. It just did. When the HR call came to Cole, it was polite. They wanted to clear the air, they said. Protocol required a conversation with building management and the executive team. The elevator that would take him to the 40th floor seemed to climb longer than usual. Numbers ticked the way a heartbeat does as a stranger is introduced into a private life. Inside the elevator, the world condensed into small panes of reflection. Cole watched himself in the metal slit and saw a man with hands that bore the industry's stories, calluses, faint grease stains, a scar on one knuckle from an old job. The watch on his wrist was scratched but reliable. Rosie had asked twice whether her father would come back early that day. He had promised, and wondered how to keep promises when corporations requested explanations for innocence. At the lobby, a security guard raised an eyebrow at his coat at the way he draped his hand over a small backpack. The elevator hissed and climbed, and with each floor the city rearranged itself in a slightly different light. The numbers on the side blinked in a rhythm. At the top, the corridor to the executive suites smelled like old money and disinfectant. Stainless steel doors lined a hallway that kept stories folded and away from the street. When Cole exited, someone from HR met him with a polite handshake that had the exact pressure of institutional kindness. Sloan descended toward the conversation with a stillness that made the air around her seem to wait. He passed under the glass case that held the small pink shoes in a lobby display, not the same glass case she kept at home. That, of course, had a private key, but a mirrored reference in the common area. The shoes in that display were replicas, token and tidy, a visual motif for the building's curated aesthetic. Cole paused almost imperceptibly, the angle of his head catching a reflection of the pair. He couldn't tell whether he felt a connection or an ache. He only registered the smooth cold of the case as a thing of other people's losses kept at a safe distance. Sloan watched him approach in the way a strategist watches the clock during a match, attentive, measured. HR walked them through the elevator lobby, through the formalities. Words were placed carefully, company policies, concern for children's safety in corporate spaces courtesy to residents and tenants. The conversation was a theatre of calm. It asked for explanations without accusation. Cole answered with the same economy he brought to work. He told them he brought Rosie because the daycare had closed early and no one was available, because he had night shifts and there was no one else to rely on, because the building had a basement and a couch and the fort that made up the hours between. He described simply the arrangements he had made. His voice wasn't defensive, it was a factual trundle of details, like a man who wanted to be understood more than pardoned. From Sloane's vantage, the story was a series of practical responses to logistical problems, and also, she felt, a moral perimeter around a human life that didn't fit her models. She saw for the first time the way policy and compassion could be folded into the same sentence. In the pause between two sentences, she thought of her own child and the way schedules of grief had replaced schedules of bedtime. A sympathetic thought crept in, unwanted and unfamiliar. As the meeting wound down, the HR representative suggested they keep an eye on the situation out of respect for both the child and the reputation of the building. Cole nodded. Public scans happen, he understood. Humans want to catalogue and verify. Sloan proposed a small amendment to security to ensure that children in public areas were accounted for, and her voice had the crispness of a woman accustomed to decisions being executed. Cole left without dramatics. He returned to the basement with the same practical tenderness with which he'd been described, checking the couch, straightening the blanket, making Mr. Button sit upright as if nothing in the world had asked for permission. Rosie was colouring and didn't look up when he entered because she was mid-sun. The resilience of children is not a show of strength so much as a refusal to give grief the power of residence over every corner of a day. That night he read her a story that had nothing to do with loss, dragons and cups of tea, and tucked the blanket up to her chin. He lingered in the doorway for a moment, fingers curled around the frame like a man grateful for thresholds. "You sleep good, kiddo," he whispered, then shut off the light, knowing that the dark had been the canvas on which she'd learned to dream. The building took its own time folding the incident into gossip and then into habit. Sloan found herself in the odd position of tracking small events she had once considered beneath the stream of her attention. She noticed when Rosie drew a picture and left it in the stairwell because children have a way of distributing their work like confetti. The drawing, simple, honest, showed an elevator with two figures, one with a long coat, one with small shoes. Across the top, in uneven letters, Rosie had written, "Mommy." Sloan stared at the drawing because it had no other intention than to be true. She felt something loosen in the cavity she'd been carrying around, like a coin in a closed fist. She put the paper down and walked away with the taste of salt on the back of her tongue, not grief's fresh edge, so much as the wear of a habit being recognized as such. She did not intrude, she measured, as she always did, the propriety of presence. There is a difference between a small, helpful act and an ownership of someone else's life. Sloan knew the line and respected it. Yet the line was not impermeable. Each time Cole's steady shadow passed through the lobby with a small pink shoe in tow, something in her office, a photograph, a schedule, the glaze on the glass case, rearranged itself and made a new space for a presence that had not been scheduled. Outside the polished windows, the city buzzed on. Inside, small rituals kept people tethered, the double knot on a child's shoe, the way a stuffed rabbit sat permanently angled toward the television, the ritual of locking a glass case that contained the past in a neat, safe rectangle. Those rituals were not interchangeable, they were personal, they were private, they were necessary. And yet, for all their privacy, rituals bleed. Once, in the quiet interim before dawn, Sloan found herself tracing the rim of her case with the side of a thumb. The metal chilled her fingertip, and she withdrew as if the memory might cling. She had rehearsed, in her head, polite responses should the situation escalate, an email to tenants, a memo outlining family policy, a call to HR that would be brief and clinical. But rehearsed responses do not move fingers or tie shoes. They do not put a thermometer to the fever of a child's small fear. Cole kept tying shoelaces twice because his mother had said once, invites carelessness, and twice implies intention. He taught Rosie to do it not as superstition, but as method. "Once is never enough, sweetheart," he would say, with a smile that undid itself at the edges. Rosie would take the lace, knot it, then tug it again with a careful, primal concentration. It was a choreography of trust. One late afternoon, Cole found himself watching Sloan in a way he had not expected to. A woman walking past the loading dock with a thermos of coffee, unhurried, wearing a coat that absorbed the winter wind instead of bargaining with it. He had no map for this interest. He only knew that her presence near the basement that night had changed the texture of the place. It was not the exposure to leadership that unnerved him. He'd worked all kinds of shifts and had seen men and women in suits who had never stooped to check a child's shoes, but it was a more personal unease. The curiosity made a small knot under his sternum. He wiped grease from a wrench and imagined a different life that had not been his. For Sloan, the curiosity had a sharper edge. She began, inadvertently, to notice small things about the maintenance man who moved like a man who had learned to hold his own sorrow in the pockets of his jacket. She saw the way his hand lingered over the couch before he left, the way he watched Rosie draw, and then would hustle back to work with the speed of a man who understood how fragile the next hour might be. It called for a small ethical question she hadn't had to weigh in months: how to be present without assuming a place in a life that was not hers to occupy. Their encounters multiplied, small, almost accidental repetitions that accumulated into a kind of pressure. Sloan watched him clear a blockage in the basement sink one night, and saw in his face the same tired patience that had been written onto her own in a different kind of loss. Cole watched her stand in the hall with a paper cup, and wondered once if grief was a language with the same consonants across the classes of the city. The building's pulse kept thumping. People found ways to place meaning on accidental contact. The office rumour mill ground on, and someone wrote an email recommending a review of the policy about children in common spaces. The paperclip culture of corporate life could make small events look large. Cole, who had spent his years learning the angles of boilers and the logic of pipes, found himself being measured by forms and polite questions. There was a human edge to the examination that made him tired for reasons a wrench could not explain. Yet in those days, when someone might be watching, small kindnesses occurred anyway. Sloan lingering to press a flyer into Cole's hands that explained a new childcare program for employees. Cole accepting it without fanfare and tucking it into his pocket like a quick credential. Rosie handing Sloan a crayon drawing through a gap in the stairwell railing and receiving, in exchange, a smile so small it could be contained in the palm of a hand. People in the building would later describe that smile as a shift, but for Sloan it was something more incremental, a crack, almost imperceptible, in the lacquer she'd been forced to maintain. It made her aware of the sound of her own chest, the way each breath had been measured in the years since Wren's death. She tried to arrange that awareness into a form she recognized: reports, meetings, schedules. But some things, like the tug of a shoelace or the scuff of a pink sole, arrive in a form less organized than policy and hit you anyway. Cole's friends at the maintenance crew joked about the little tenant, a term that floated between affection and the practical pity the men sometimes allowed themselves. They would tease him about the photos he kept on his phone. Rosie smiling with peanut butter on her upper lip, a picture of Mr. Buttons in a paper crown, and he would take it in stride with a laugh that sounded slightly like breaking. He did not need their sympathy. He needed a harbour, and he had one in the corner of the basement where a pallet and a lamp made a quiet world for the child who had been left with no instruction manual for missing a mother. And Sloan, she began to leave for the building earlier than she needed to sometimes, not because of obligation to schedule, but because there was now a slot in her day she had not known she would like to fill. She would often stand by a window and watch the evening unfurl. The river like a blade of light, traffic moving with the choreography of a pulse. There was a human life beneath the movements of a city that wanted nothing from her and everything she could give without making demands. She found herself wanting to give a small, precise thing, presence. The story escalated in ordinary ways. An offhand comment at a board meeting about security risks associated with unfamiliar children made its way down the hall and then into HR's mandated meeting. Cole received the polite summons and prepared himself with the same practical focus he brought to a broken heater. Fix what you can, accept what you cannot. On the day he rode the elevator up, the city outside the glass box was moving as usual, autobahn of decisions, of bright billboards that had nothing to say about how to bind a child's shoelaces. He pressed the button for the 40th floor and felt the car rise like a slow heartbeat. The elevator's light hummed overhead like a small, intimate star. For a moment, the world narrowed to the space between numbers on an LED and the rhythm of his own breath. When the doors opened on the 40th floor, someone from HR stood waiting with a clipboard. They offered him a chair that seemed to be part of a set reserved for people who needed to explain themselves. He sat as if on an old stool and answered questions about schedules and backup plans. Sloan watched with the composed interest of someone whose job included measuring concern. The meeting was careful and courteous. The language was precise. But there was a sound beneath the correctness, the small, steady thudding in Cole's chest that matched the one in Sloan's. Neither put it into words. Neither needed to. In the pause between the last administrative sentence and the exchange of thanks, the building held its breath as if expecting a verdict. The question of why a child would shout "Mommy" at a woman who was not her mother had not yet found its answer. The answers, when they came, would not be policy memos, but little, lived moments, tugs of laces, the weight of a soft, stuffed animal, the habit of showing up. Cole rose when the meeting ended. He walked back into the corridor with the same practical grace that had carried him through so many nights. The elevator hummed and carried him down, each floor a small descent toward the place where a couch waited and a child dreamed. He thought briefly about the drawing Rosie had left on the stairwell, an elevator, and two figures and the word "Mommy" in an earnest script, and he folded the memory into himself like a quiet parcel. The day did not answer the question. It only set the pieces moving. In the spaces between decisions and policies, between shoelace knots and glass cases, something like a possibility had begun to grow, not as a plan but as a small, unguided thing that lives inside the voluntary actions of strangers. When the elevator doors closed and the building resumed the efficient business of its hours, Sloan found herself staring at the replicated pink shoes in the lobby display. They were smaller than any problem she had to solve that day, but not smaller than what she felt. She pressed her thumb to the glass and felt nothing but cold and a reflection of her own face. For a moment she allowed the image of a child's small scuff to sit with the rest of her day. It did not fit into a spreadsheet. It did not need to. Outside, the night made its small, honest claims. In the basement, a couch sighed with the weight of a sleeping child. In a quiet corner of the city's architecture, lives began to intersect in ways no policy could foresee. The elevator's recorded silence remained in the walls like a secret, waiting to be translated into sentences that might or might not change the direction of people's lives. Days softened into a rhythm the building could not quite catalogue. Small things accrued like pennies in a jar, a drawing left on a stairwell step, a paper cup abandoned and then reclaimed by Sloan from a janitor's trolley, the way Cole's jacket hung the same way on the same hook after a shift. The incident in the elevator did not vanish. It folded into other events and then unfolded again when someone needed to remember it. For Sloan, the echo of a child's voice lived under the polished surface of her schedule, a persistent grain that would not sand away. One afternoon, 2 weeks after the HR meeting, Sloan asked to speak with Cole again. This time, it was not HR paperwork, nor corporate posture. It was an invitation that arrived with the weight of a personal decision. The email had the brevity of someone used to efficiency. Please stop by my office when you have a moment. No secretary, no clipboard, just a note with room for something unscripted. Cole felt the ascent of the elevator as if it were a small rite, numbers clicking upward, his reflection shrinking between polished stainless. He smoothed his jacket and told himself not to rehearse too much. He had answered questions, explained schedules, described the couch and Mr. Buttons. Now he was going to meet the woman whose presence had changed the light in the stairwell. He stepped into her floor with the same steady stride he reserved for emergency fixes, as if calm could be a tool one carried in a toolbox. Sloan was waiting behind a broad desk that held the precise footprint of a controlled life. A leather planner, a slim tablet, a single photograph in a frame with an edge of silver. Behind her, the city unfurled in the late afternoon light, a grid of distant cars and glass. The office smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and cold coffee. Sloan rose when he entered, smoothing the hem of a coat she would soon remove. "Thank you for coming," she said. There was no announcement in the words, no excessive warmth. It was a sentence made of the same texture as the woman, deliberate, clear. Cole nodded, hands finding the seam of his palms where grease sometimes left a faint residue. They sat, a small island of two, in a room full of measured silence. Sloan folded her hands in front of her and studied his face with the same attention she gave a ledger when she suspected a discrepancy. "Tell me about her," Sloan said, and the request surprised him only because it was personal rather than procedural. "Tell me about Rosie." Cole blinked, as if finding a hinge in the sentence. He spoke slowly, detailing in short, sure moments the domestic geography of their life, the bedtime story with dragons and tea, the shoebox of drawings, the way Mr. Buttons always had one ear ready to listen. He spoke of Meredith the way people speak of a room they once inhabited. They catalogue the furniture, the light, the sound of the door shutting. He did not ask for pity or permission. He was simply mapping the life someone else's child occupied. Sloan listened without interrupting. She nodded at bits of information she could fit into her sense of order: daycare closures, night shifts, a couch in a basement. But there was something in the rhythm of Cole's telling, the small, continuous attention he paid to the details of care, that unsettled her. It was not the thing she had been trained to measure, but it was a calculation of another kind. "Why did you bring her into the building that night?" she asked finally, and the tone was not accusatory so much as purposeful. She was searching for the reasoning that bridged a child's proclamation and a CEO's image. Cole looked at her in a way that made her feel slightly exposed, not because he meant to make her vulnerable, but because his gaze registered things differently. He was used to assessing work by result, not by appearance. He paused, as if choosing a precise tool from a kit, and then said plainly, with the quiet weight of someone who had recited this explanation many times to himself, "Because she doesn't know what a mother looks like. She only knows what a mother feels like." The line landed in the office like an audible shift in temperature. Sloan felt it before she could craft a response, the sharp reformation of an old grief that had been folded into the architecture of her days. It was not the embarrassment of the elevator incident that struck her now. It was the truth of his words. They were not a defense. They were an observation made from the center of a life lived in hand-to-hand care. Cole's voice was steady and contained no self-pity. The sentence opened a space inside Sloan that had been held rigid and closed. Silence followed, full and heavy and somehow honest. Sloane's eyes dropped to the corner of her desk, where a crystal paperweight sat like a captured raindrop. In the pause, she felt the shapes of her own rituals, things she had kept boxed and pristine, tilt under the pressure of something neither neat nor quantifiable. "Show me the drawing," she heard herself say, and the request surprised her as much as it did him. Cole reached for his wallet and brought out a small square of paper he carried like a relic. It was a crayon rendering of an elevator, 2 stick figures, a sun, and the word "Mommy" scribbled in large, uncertain letters. Sloan took it with hands that were not quite steady. Up close, the crayon strokes were a geography of care, the long coat, the small shoes, coloured somewhat outside the lines, the sun smiling in thick yellow. The paper had a faint coffee ring on one edge where Cole once set a cup while checking the couch. Sloan put the drawing down on her desk the way someone might set a fragile artifact, careful, reverent. Her face held a small breakdown of composure. She did not cry. She inhaled and let out something like a sound that balanced on a question. Who am I that I can stand before this and not fall apart? She thought of Wren, of the small pink shoes she had placed in a case and never opened for 3 years, and felt the walls she had constructed around that memory begin to crack along minute lines. "Those shoes," Sloan said softly, and the phrase had the quiet import of an opening mouth at the edge of a wound. "They look like Wren's." She rose, slow as an idea taking shape, and walked to the case that sat tucked into a corner of the office. Even though the building had its public display, in Sloan's private room she kept a smaller case, an artifact wrapped in ritual. For 3 years it had been a thing unlidded only in the privacy of her grief. Now she opened it in her office, where the city could see the light through the windows, and the hum of corporate life persisted beyond the glass. Inside were the pink shoes worn at the toes, faintly scuffed, with the kind of small abrasions that indicated a life being lived rather than preserved. Sloan slid a hand over the leather and felt, with the impression of the touch, a memory that was not merely visual but embodied. The room seemed to breathe with her as if the office itself had been waiting for the lid to lift and to exhale. Cole watched her with unquestioning attention. He did not step forward. He did not reach out to touch the shoes or to reconstruct the past. He offered only presence and the factualness of a man who kept his grief in the continuity of care. Sloan raised the shoes to her face and took in that unique, almost childlike smell that leather and memory create. The faint hint of dust and the ghost of a playground. Her posture shifted. Something unmade in her face allowed a break in the line she had been cutting through her days. She placed the shoes on the desk between them, as if making the thing a shared object, and for a moment both the CEO and the maintenance man were caretakers of the same small relic. "Why would she call me that?" Sloan asked, voice caught somewhere between curiosity and a quiet accusation aimed at her own closed heart. Cole met her gaze and answered exactly what he had known. She doesn't know what a mother looks like. She only knows what a mother feels like. Hearing his line aloud in that room, out of the basement, out of the stairwell, under fluorescent tubes, changed the way the phrase struck the air. Sloane's mouth opened on a breath, and she let a soft laugh gather that was less amusement and more an admitted surprise at how blunt truth can be when it lands. It was not relief, it was recognition. Sloan did not unravel in spectacle. She folded the moment into her schedule like a new task to be handled with care. There were policies and image considerations, sure, but there was also a human fact. A child had experienced her as comforting, as someone who could steady and mend. The office that had once been a place of cold measurements became a site for a decision that could not be dictated by market analysts. Could she show up in a life that was not hers to fix, simply as someone who was willing to be present? When the meeting ended, they did not exchange declarations. Instead, there was a negotiation of boundaries, soft, precise phrases about intentions and consent. Sloan asked how she could help without overstepping. Cole set the terms with the same steady clarity he'd used with boilers and shoes. No promises of replacement, no attempts to rewrite memories, only the offer of occasional presence when invited. He would not allow ceremonies that suggested a substitute. Sloan accepted the terms with a nod that carried a kind of solemn gratitude. "Would you come to soccer?" Cole asked at the end of the conversation, the question small and practical, no flourish. "This Saturday. She likes it when people watch." Sloan surprised herself by answering yes. Not because she believed it would change grief overnight, but because it was a way to move from the theory of presence into the practice of it. It would be a place to be public and thrice vulnerable, on grass, under sun, among parents and shoes and the unpredictable spill of children. She had not been spectator to such ordinary domestic noise in years. Saturday arrived with the crispness of an ordinary day. The soccer field was a rectangle of green near a school, fringed by other parents who formed a low, ongoing chorus of encouragement and counsel. Rosie collided with the world in the way little children do, running when it suited her, distracted when a butterfly crossed her path, sternly competitive when the ball was near. Cole stood near the sidelines, hands in his pockets, watching with that particular watchfulness of someone who knows how quickly a small life can strafe into danger. He carried in his palm the same practiced calm he had at work. He had learned to breathe through the small crises. Sloan arrived carefully. She had chosen jeans instead of the tailored suits that usually made a statement in boardrooms. Her hair was pulled back in a practical knot, and she walked slower than she did in meetings, letting the sound of the grass under her shoes register. Parents glanced her way, recognizing the woman from photographs, but the field has a leveling power. Here the currency was cheer, not capital. She took a seat on the low metal bleachers and watched. At first she kept to herself, an island of observation. Her hands rested on her knees and she followed Rosie's small maneuvers, a sudden dart to pick up imaginary treasure, a serious attempt at a pass, a dramatic tumble that left her giggling. There was no grand performance of her kindness. She simply sat and let the afternoon happen around her. And then, in a fluke that was both comedic and tender, Rosie kicked the ball in the wrong direction, toward a cluster of cones, and into a neighbour's nearly intact snack line. The ball ricocheted and, by happy accident, trickled into the goal with a gentle clatter. There was a moment of startled silence, and then, like a tide answering a call, the crowd erupted into cheers. Cole laughed aloud, a sound that was half release and half disbelief. Sloan felt something lift in her chest, a pressure loosened not by epiphany, but by the simple shared joy of being present for a child's accidental victory. Without thinking, she rose and clapped, hands meeting in applause that was as ordinary as anyone else's. Rosie looked up and found her eyes, and for a breathless second the three of them stood in a new configuration. Rosie, who had run and scored without strategy, Cole, who had held the net of care steady, and Sloan, who had simply shown up. After the game, Sloan approached on the sideline with a small acknowledgement she had not rehearsed. She knelt, not with the programmatic exactness she had used once in the basement, but with a gentleness that had been practiced in the small hours of the week since the meeting. She handed Rosie a bottle of water, asked about the purple backpack, and for the first time in months allowed a smile to rest openly on her face. It was not a cure. It was an admission that the world could still hold warmth. From that day, presence became a new ritual rather than a singular revelation. Sloan did not insert herself into every corner of Rosie's life. She honored the boundaries they had set. But she began to attend when invited, a recital, a playground meet, a school play with a single, blinking spotlight. Each time she came, she sat in the modest way she had learned, a person in the crowd whose attention was a quiet gift. Time passed the way it does when small, steady acts collect into a pattern. Saturdays multiplied. Meals were shared occasionally in Cole's modest kitchen, Sloan bringing attempts at simple dishes she had ordered through classes and blogs, trying to translate efficiency into the improvisation of home cooking. Sometimes it was awkward, trays that slipped, instructions misread, laughter at spilled sauce. Other times it was seamless, spaghetti boiled precisely because she had measured it like a project, and they all ate with the comfortable silence of people who know each other enough to be unremarkable together. The double tie ritual continued and took on new meaning. Sloan learned, in a quiet corner of evenings, to sit on the floor and help Rosie loop the laces, to tug the knot twice the way Cole had taught his daughter. She found in that small repetition a language she understood, a practical, physical act that translated into care. It was not a replacement for Wren, nor a rewrite of the past, but an addition to the present that allowed Sloane's hands to mean kindness in a way that words had not allowed. Their lives overlapped in incremental ways, a calendar filled with modest appointments, soccer, a school art show, a Halloween where Sloan wore an outlandish hat that made a child near Rosie's shriek with delighted horror. There were moments of hilarity and moments of melancholy that came in comfortable intervals. They learned each other's edges and honored them. Cole continued to insist on not letting boundary questions be trampled. Sloan continued to respect that insistence. One winter evening, 6 months after the elevator hush, Rosie sat at the small card table in the basement and drew with the concentration of someone inventing an entire world on a single sheet of paper. Cole read by lamplight nearby. Sloan had come down for a Saturday dinner and had stayed longer than either of them expected, whisked into the domestic orbit by a pasta bowl she had tried and a conversation she could not quite step away from. Mr. Buttons sat vigilant on the couch, ear at attention. Rosie handed up the picture she had made, and the two adults looked at it together. 3 stick figures holding hands under a sun that took most of the sky. Above them, in a bold, shaky script, was a new word, better. The transformation of the drawing was quiet magic. Mommy no longer necessary, because now there was a new word to describe the way the small family had rearranged itself into something that both honored loss and acknowledged the tenderness at hand. Cole and Sloan exchanged a look that was both gratitude and recognition. The word was not a decree, it was a child's observation that life, like glue on paper, could take on new shapes. They did not speak the tidy words of resolution. Instead, they folded the paper and placed it in the shoebox next to the other artifacts of Rosie's life, where the drawings, the tooth, and the ticket stubs sat like milestones. The months continued to shape the new geometry of their relations. Sloan remained precise in business and patient in the small tasks of domesticity. Cole moved between shifts, keeping his routines intact, checking the couch, tucking in the blanket, making sure the shoelaces were done twice and right. Both of them learned to be present without claiming to fix what had been lost. Theirs was not a story about being replaced, it was about being available. There were small tests, awkward encounters with people who did not understand the terms they had negotiated, or whispers that tried to make new narratives from the same facts. On such days they were careful and clear. Sloan said once, in a conversation where curiosity risked becoming presumption, "I am not here to be a substitute. I am here because this child found me safe, and that is something to honor." Cole accepted the statement with a simple nod that sealed the balance they had created. Respect for boundaries, respect for memory, respect for what a child needs in a given moment. In another quiet ritual, the one that mattered the most, Sloan began to keep a small pair of shoelaces in her office desk drawer. Not for any grand plan, but as a token. When Rosie visited or when she arrived at the field, Sloan would pull them out and practice the loop, pull, and tug that had become a practical benediction of care. She tugged twice as Cole had taught Rosie to do. She tugged twice as an acknowledgement that a single act was not enough to hold a life together. That repetition mattered. The gesture became a silent language between them. A tug of lace equaled attention. A tug of lace equaled someone's promise to show up, if only in small, reliable ways. On an unremarkable weekday, as light from the late afternoon sliced through the office and dust motes drifted like small, slow planets, Sloan sat at her desk and took the pink shoes from the glass case. She put them into a small box and carried them, with a carefulness that had the gravity of ritual, down to the basement where Rosie and Cole were reading by lamplight. The walk was not dramatic. It was an ordinary movement that had been impossible months earlier. She opened the basement door and stepped into the warm smell of old blankets and crayons. Rosie looked up, her small face bright with the kind of greeting that does not require words. Sloan sat on the couch and placed the shoes on the coffee table between them. She did not turn them into a spectacle. She let them be quiet objects of memory, and she let the safe smallness of the basement absorb them. "Once is never enough, sweetheart," Cole said at some point, perhaps in reminder, or perhaps simply as part of his instruction, and Sloan watched the way Rosie's hands moved to imitate the motion she had watched so many times. Sloan reached forward and helped with the final tug, her fingers finding the lace and pulling twice with a careful decisiveness that had become, for her, a new grammar. Rosie glanced up and smiled, unmotivated by explanation. The soft domesticity of that moment, shoe, knot, second pull, satisfied face, was an ordinary miracle. It had nothing to do with headlines or shareholder reports. It had to do with two adults learning how to be gentle in the places where discomfort had lodged for too long. They did not pretend grief was gone. Sloan sometimes left the basement with her chest heavy in ways that felt familiar. Cole sometimes stared at the ceiling at night and felt the quiet ache that belonged to him alone. But grief shared its hours now with a fold of consolation. There was a space in which Wren and Meredith could both be remembered without being replaced. There was a space large enough to allow for the cohabitation of absence and presence. In the months that followed, ritual became their grammar. The double tie held meaning beyond safety. It became an emblem of intention. The pink shoes, once sealed away, were handled with reverence and allowed to exist as both memorial and catalyst. Mr. Buttons retained his seat on the couch. The shoebox of drawings swelled with suns and ladders, small portraits that recorded the new shape of their lives. The drawing that began with Mommy and ended with Better was taped where Rosie could see it and where Sloan could be reminded of the simplicity with which a child reframed the world. On an evening that felt like any other, Sloan stood in the basement doorway holding a small box in her hands. Cole and Rosie were finishing a story. Through the soft domestic hum, pages turning, the low scrape of a lamp being adjusted, Sloan went over and sat on the edge of the couch. She placed the box beside Mr. Buttons and opened it. Inside were not the pink shoes themselves, those remained in their case, but a pair of spare laces she had bought that afternoon, neat and new. She offered them to Rosie like a small, practical offering. Rosie took them and held them up to the lamplight, then looked at Sloan with an attention that had the blunt logic of a child. "Because once is never enough," she announced, as if quoting something timeless and obvious. Sloan smiled and tied the first knot for her, then the second, tugging each time with intention. The tug was quieter now, It carried no ceremony, only the steady presence of someone who knew how to make a small life feel expected and protected. Cole watched from the doorway with a quiet gratitude that did not require words. Years, if they come, would write their own story on top of this one. But for now, the building kept its small truths intact. An elevator that once held an embarrassing moment which turned out to be a revelation. A CEO who learned to sit on metal bleachers and clap for a child's wrong-headed goal. A maintenance man who taught his daughter to knot a lace twice and who kept a shoebox of art like a miniature archive of love. The rituals had bled across class lines and formed new patterns that were not tidy and not forced. They were, in their modesty, resilient. When people later recounted the event, how a child had shouted "Mommy," and how a CEO had been shocked by a single father's answer, they would often begin with the image of the elevator silence. But the reason for Sloane's shock was never the social awkwardness, it was the clarity of Cole's truth. He had named a fact children know intuitively: presence translates to mothering more faithfully than appearance ever could. That naming opened something within Sloane that time alone hadn't reached. It allowed her to act, not to occupy a place, but to be a consistent presence in a life that needed small, concrete kindnesses. The last image the building would carry from the months that followed was simple and repeatable. Sloane, sleeves rolled up, kneeling on the basement floor, tugging a shoelace for the second time with the soft deliberateness of someone who had learned the vocabulary of care. Rosie would pat Sloane's hand and then, with the certainty of a child, begin to draw another sun, because the world, stitched together bit by bit, needed light. If this story touched you, share it with someone who cares about the quiet ways people come back to life. And for more stories about ordinary kindness, consider subscribing.